Hi, my name is Abbey and today I'm going to be discussing Snyder's Bloodlands and Chirrut's Understanding Genocide. First, I'd like to start off with a brief summary of both of these texts and then move into comparison of both of them. And lastly, I'd like to conclude by offering a few points of criticism. So first, for Bloodlands, in this piece, Snyder describes the area between Eastern and Western Europe known as the Bloodlands, and these areas were controlled by Stalin and Hitler respectively. And this area was characterized in the 30s and 40s as an area of mass killing and where two genocides came together to create double the amount of suffering they would have on their own and as they did on their own. And to aid the audience in understanding the motives of the perpetrators in both of these genocides that in the Bloodlands convened and met into one, Snyder provides 2 points of view as to how both Hitler and Stalin viewed their victims. First, Snyder offers Arendt's point of view. Her point of view is not necessarily that Hitler and Stalin subjugated their victims to non-human, but rather they viewed them as human scapegoats. And that's important because it doesn't necessarily take away their humanity, but rather blames them for something that they are suspected to have done. In this example, Hitler blames the Jews for creating a Jewish conspiracy and tanking the German state. Although that's not true, it provided blame to a group that Hitler saw as racially impure and wanted to get rid of. On the other hand, Grossman's point of view says that both Hitler and Stalin did in fact view their victims as subhuman and thus lighten the moral gravity of death for both Hitler and Stalin. Because is it really killing if these beings are non-human and worthless and extraneous and have an extraneous existence? So why are these 2 points of view important in understanding the main heart of this reading? Snyder's point is that it's important to understand the perpetrator's point of view in studying genocide sociologically. Snyder describes that often people examining genocide want to identify with the victim. We want to share the victims' stories, and we want to honor the victims, and of course that's justified, but understanding genocide in a sociological context, it's very important to understand the conditions that created and allowed people to carry out genocide and be complicit. So it's important for us to understand what was going through the minds of the people who carried out the genocide. And Snyder brings up a key point in this. Many of the people who carried out the genocide and the killings were not ideologically motivated. Although people at the top, like Hitler and Stalin, were very much ideologically motivated and attempted to dispel their ideologies to the people below them, your everyday police officer or train conductor was not necessarily ideologically motivated, but rather just complicit in what they thought they were supposed to do. In addition, Snyder also says that often these people were given an ultimatum of you can save your family or you can, sacrifice a group of people who you don't know, and often that was Jews or Romani or whoever was considered undesirable. So what's important about this is that these people are called collaborators and are not necessarily the people who are doling out the ideology that carries on the genocide, but they do very much outnumber the people who are. However, what is important is that they're still doing the killing and feel as though they're in a position where they have no other option. This brings me to the summary of Chirrut's Understanding Genocide. In this piece, Chirrut basically seeks to define what a genocide is, and he describes it as politically motivated killing. So that pretty clearly fits the Holocaust and Stalin's Great Terror, as they were both trying to create what they thought was a utopia and sought to get rid of anyone who they believed came in the way of that. So Chirrut goes through a few different types of genocide. He labels these types as convenience, revenge, fear, and purification. Pretty obviously, Hitler was seeking a racially purified state, people he believed were ethnically German, so that falls under the category of racial purification. In Stalin's case, he was trying to get rid of anyone who came in the way of his vision of a communist Soviet Union. So in his case, it could be labeled a convenience, and this is what brings me to my comparison of both of these pieces. Both of these pieces are trying to label and define the motives and worldviews of the people who are perpetrating ideologically and non-ideologically the genocides that occurred in the Bloodlands, a particularly violent area in Europe at this time. So I'd like to take a quote from Chirrut's reading on page 19. He says, quote, "Mass political murder follows its own logic, and we can only understand it if we follow the logic." Very clearly, he explains here why it's so important to understand from the perpetrator's perspective why genocide occurs. Although we like to label these people as sick and non-thinking, they are still human, and that means they're making human decisions. And as other humans, we need to understand why they make these decisions so we can prevent genocide in the future. The comparison between these pieces are really significant because Chirrut explains more the theoretical aspects of how we analyze genocide, and Snyder gives a very clear example in the case of the Bloodlands as to how this actually carried out. And understanding it theoretically in the case of a sociological study is very important to get to the means that we're trying to get to, which is understanding and preventing in the future. Snyder also explains, quote, on page 400, "Ideologies also tempt those who reject them. Ideology, when stripped by time or partisanship of its political and economic connections, becomes a moralizing form of explanation for mass killing, one that comfortably separates the people who explain from the people who kill." And again, this mirrors Chirrut's sentiment that I previously explained. Identifying with the victim is not necessarily the objective when understanding genocide from a sociological perspective, because it fails to recognize why it happened in the first place. If we constantly say, oh, this just happened, senselessly, senseless violence, we're failing to understand how to prevent it again, and what are the factors that lead up to genocide, and what are the ideological factors, because that is our area of study. What are the ideological factors that are important to the build-up to this genocide? So now I'd like to move into a few points of criticism. Although they are small, I think the wording is very important. So I'd like to criticize the use of the word temptation in Snyder's reading. He often uses the word temptation to describe people who are complicit in violence, although they might not necessarily be ideologically motivated. However, they are, in Snyder's words, tempted by it. I think that's an interesting word, temptation, because it gives the impression that humans are naturally inclined towards violence and subjugating others. So I would advise him to be careful with his word temptation, because I think it creates a certain type of assumption about human nature, which is hard to do within sociological study, because we're not necessarily understanding the or trying to understand the individual by themselves. We're trying to understand how society works as a whole. So using the word temptation makes certain, denotes certain preconceived notions about human nature, which I don't know or that we're able to confirm or really study. So I think temptation, if he's going to use that word, needs to be expanded upon in the context of why be tempted to be violent, what is the other alternative, and I think he could have elaborated more on the people who were often put in a position of having to choose the lesser of two evils. So I would have liked him to explain it in the context more of between what choices people had to make rather than being tempted by violence and power. And my second point of point is in Charit's reading. When he's describing the dangers of defining genocide either too broadly or too narrowly, he uses the word voluntary assimilation. So in context, what he says is that defining genocide too broadly leads to the danger of describing something such as voluntary assimilation when people are choosing to conform to a certain culture that's not necessarily their own. It could lead to people describing that as genocide. I question the word voluntary because often there's internalized factors in which, although it might seem voluntary on the surface, it's not. So, for example, many Jews in Hitler's Germany were already assimilated. Anti-Semitism did not start in Germany with the Holocaust. Anti-Semitism in Europe had gone back centuries, in the whole world as a whole, but specifically in Europe, this was not the start of anti-Semitism. So as a result, many Jews had already, prior to the Holocaust, assimilated into German society, meaning they were largely non-practicing, not very religious, primarily identified as Germans rather than a German Jew. They were Jewish Germans. So voluntary is, in a vacuum, the word voluntary makes sense to use. However, taken out of context, when you use the word voluntary, it's easy to ignore the factors that might have encouraged someone to assimilate. So in a way, broadening the definition of genocide might be helpful just because there are many times in many cultures where people have assimilated and it seemed voluntary, but it really has to do more with internalized hate of their culture. So that's a very important thing to revisit in the Charit article. So in conclusion, both of these articles really do a great job at describing where we need to direct our focus as people studying sociology, and that really what we need to be studying in large is the motivations of people who are perpetrating genocide. And the Bloodlands is a great example of very orchestrated and calculated genocide, and how we can study the people at the forefront of that to understand genocide and prevent it in the future. So, thank you.